Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees and all living nature, of which we're an integral part, and with deep gratitude to all the generations before us that have brought us to the present moment in our human journey, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we embark on our second week of a 10-day program on nonviolence. I can't think of a more appropriate topic to be delving into right now on Humanity Rising, given current world conditions, than the power of nonviolence and how we can apply the theory of nonviolence in practical, everyday ways, which is the particular theme of this session. As you know, we've been tracking events in Iran after the death of Mahsa Amini several weeks ago, a young woman who was beaten to death essentially for not having her job on exactly right by the morality police. And somehow that turned into a George Floyd moment. And protests have now happened all over the world. There were several hundred protests in various cities worldwide over the weekend. And we've had Banafsheh Sayad, who's from Iran, whose family was forced into exile, who's been living for the last 44 years, the agony of what it means to have such a coercive regime, giving us reports on a daily basis. And so I'd like to turn over the program now as we begin this session to Banafsheh, who will give us an update and then guide us into a coherence breathing practice that we do each day on Humanity Rising, and then introduce our program. So Banafsheh, thank you so much for everything that you and women all over the world are doing at this extraordinary moment, and I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everyone. On Saturday, October 1st, peaceful rallies were organized in 170 cities around the world. Can you share the first slide, please? This is from Los Angeles, where I live. We were 22,000 people marching. Next slide, please. The idea was conceived by Hamid Esmailion, a Kurdish activist based in Canada, whose wife and daughter were among the 176 people killed aboard the Ukrainian flight en route from Tehran to Kiev by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on January 8, 2020, shortly after takeoff. As the spokesperson for the families of victims of this flight, Ukrainian flight, he has called on the international community to downgrade diplomatic ties with the Islamic Republic and expel the regime's ambassadors from their countries. You can stop sharing the slide. Meanwhile, in Iran, we hear that the protests have not abated despite a growing death toll and the crackdown by security forces using tear gas, clubs, and live ammunition. Yesterday, there were demonstrations in several cities, including Tehran, Yazd, Kermanshah, Sanandaj, Shiraz, and Mashhad. Students were demonstrating inside the prestigious Sharif University of Technology in Tehran in the afternoon when riot police surrounded the university for several hours, trapping the students and leaving several injured before arresting a number of them in the latest crackdown on protesters. Because the government is severely restricting internet access, the news is very sporadic. Authorities are still blocking access to WhatsApp and Instagram, social media service, other social media services, so that the protesters cannot organize protests and share information. They're heavily restricting internet access, especially in the afternoons and the evenings, to prevent people from gathering and forming protests. In his first public comments, the so-called supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, denounced the nationwide protests today as riots that he claimed had been planned by the US and Israel, as well as their paid agents with the help of some traitorous Iranians abroad, meaning us. Iranian human rights, a Norway-based group, announced in a statement yesterday that so far 133 people had been killed across Iran, and more than 1,500 have been detained, including journalists, activists, university students, and soccer players. Exact numbers cannot be confirmed due to the lack of independent investigative mechanisms. We need the UN member states to go beyond making empty statements and really hear the cries for justice from victims and human rights defenders in Iran, and urgently set up an independent UN investigative mechanism. We do know that Nilufar Hamedi, a reporter with the daily Shahr newspaper, one of the first to report on Mahsa's hospitalization and death, was arrested in her home in Tehran last week. Authorities have meanwhile arrested Elahe Mohammadi, another female journalist who reported on Mahsa's funeral earlier this month in the Kurdish town of Saqqez. These two women are among countless journalists to have been imprisoned since Mahsa's death. The singer, songwriter Shervin Hajipour, whose viral song has become the anthem for anti-government protests in Iran and around the world, has also been arrested by the police with his whereabouts currently unknown. A few days before his arrest on September 29th, Shervin posted his moving song on Instagram describing the situation in Iran, which was triggered by Mahsa Amini's death, her murder. His song, Baraye, garnered more than 40 million views on Instagram and spread on other social media platforms before it was removed. The lyrics of Hajipour's song, Shervin's song, were woven from tweets posted by Iranians following Mahsa's death, many of them blaming the country's clerical leadership for the current social, economic, and political problems. Matt, can you play the third slide, which has Shervin's video?
برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک زباله‌گرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه، برای گریه های بیوقفه، برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره ای که میخنده، برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای غرصای حساب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی.
Many young women are refusing to wear the compulsory hijab while going around town, doing their day-to-day life activities as an act of defiance of extraordinary proportions that could mean imprisonment and even death. We have been in direct communication with some of these brave women in Iran, and when we ask them what they want us to do here in the West in support of the movement, they said, send us light and love, hold us in peace. And so I'm here to ask our group, this community, to do just that. And because in order to wish and pray for peace, we need to reside in peace, I invite us to establish ourselves in peace first with a short meditation and focus on sending light and love to these brave warriors. There is a type of breathing, says Rumi, that is constriction, and there is another that opens you to infinity. I call the second type of breathing a love breath. And Jim has been movement. They said, send us light and love. What happened? As Jim has been inviting people, inviting you to breathe together in the opening of the sessions on Humanity Rising, I'm also going to invite you into the coherent breathing, which I like to call a love breath, as it opens us to infinity and connects us as a group to the source of our being and to one another. As you know, as many of you know, but maybe we have new people joining us today, this is a slow, even breathing that devotes the same amount of time to your inhalation as to your exhalation. The optimal timing of this breath rhythm is about 5.5 seconds for the inhale and 5.5 seconds for the exhale, which comes to about 5.5 breaths per minute. By breathing in this slow, even rhythm, you are creating balance in your autonomic nervous system between the sympathetic or fight or flight response and the parasympathetic or rest and relaxation response. Your inhale promotes a sympathetic response in your body, while your exhale as the relaxation portion of your breath promotes a parasympathetic response, which allows your heart rate to slow down and your blood pressure to lower, eliciting a sense of calm, inner calm and peacefulness. So please sit comfortably, sense the ground with your feet, both feet. Relax and release your weight onto what you're sitting on, and maintain a vertical posture with ease, letting your torso lift and elongate without tension as much as possible, and rest the back of your hands on your lap. You're going to inhale and exhale through your nose, as I said, keeping your mouth closed. You can let your teeth be slightly separated and place, if you wish, the tip of your tongue on the roof of your mouth right behind your upper teeth, which increases balance and coordination and improves spatial awareness, reduces stress. Let your inhale and exhale unfold evenly across the 5.5 second period and activate your diaphragm, the main muscle used for breathing, that contracts and moves downward into your abdominal cavity when you breathe in, which creates negative pressure in the chest, in your chest cavity, allowing air to flow in through your nostrils and fill the empty space in your chest. You can put your hands to begin with on your lower ribs. Feel them expand to the sides with your inhale and let them deflate toward the midline with your exhale. And just repeat that. We're going to do this breathing with the sound of the bells that will signal when to inhale and when to exhale. I invite you to close your eyes after you watch the animation for a few seconds. Please continue breathing with your eyes closed and come in touch with your heart. breathing in and out of your heart space. And feel how as you breathe in the precious life force, you're igniting and expanding the light in your heart. And how with your exhalation you spread this light out into the environment. Now connect your heart with the hearts of those on this call from different parts of the world. And feel how as you merge the light of your heart with the rest of us into one heart, you start to feel an expansiveness in your own heart and body. Now let's together please beam this light into Iran, into the hearts of the brave women and men who are standing up for their right to live as free human beings, empowering them, energizing them, letting them feel our support and our allegiance, holding their safe passage through this turbulence, and seeing freedom, justice, and peace once again permeating the ancient land of Persia in the name of love. And so it is. Amen. And when you're ready, please open your eyes and behold this beautiful graphic of Mahsa Amini, the messenger of Ma, the great mother, in front of the map of Iran, holding the hijab or the Islamic headdress as defiance and an emblem of freedom. Mahsa has catalyzed a global liberation movement that is starting in Iran. Can you please stop sharing the slide? Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. I have a question for the panelists. I have a question on behalf of the women in Iran and those of us around the world. We would like to know, we would like you to imagine you are in Iran right now, looking down the barrel of a gun. How do you put your nonviolent perspectives into action? We know that the majority of the women who are leading this uprising want a nonviolent regime change. But they are facing a ruthless dictatorship that has proved it does not value the lives of their citizens. What is your message to them, to these warriors? Thank you. Tom, Michael.
Thank you, Banafshe. As Michael and I were designing these 2 weeks on nonviolence, the arc of the 2 weeks, the first week was very much on the history, the theoretical pieces of nonviolence. And our intention was that the second week was very much around action. And so the timing of having you with us on Friday what happened on Saturday, what's going on now in Iran. Couldn't have been better timing from our perspective. And so it's just such a delight to have you with us today. Thank you again for joining us. And we really look forward to answering your question and having each of our panelists, not only today, but throughout the week, share how nonviolent action does work. And so I'm going to quickly invite our panelists into the conversation and ask each of them as they're presenting and sharing what they have to answer not just your question, but the question to the women in Iran and the women and men throughout the world. So Michael Nagler is an emeritus professor of classics and comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley. He teaches in the Peace and Conflict Studies program he founded on that campus in the 1970s. In addition to teaching at Berkeley, Michael speaks frequently for media and the general public on issues of peace and nonviolence, and does presentations around the world for the Blue Mountain Center of Meditation. Michael's written 6 books and contributes articles frequently to Tikkun, Yes Magazine, and many other progressive journals. He's consulted for the U.S. Institute of Peace and many organizations and projects dealing with nonviolence and world peace. Michael's a founder, president of the Metta Center, and the writer and director of the Third Harmony film. Thank you, Michael, and welcome. Michael, do you want to go ahead and respond to Banafshe's question, and then I'll introduce the rest of the panelists?
Yes, I feel very privileged to do that, Banafshe. I wrote this to you in the chat, but I'll mention it again here. I guess if I had the opportunity to speak to those women in particular, I would say, be brave. The truth and nonviolence will prevail. And finally, you are not, excuse me, you are not alone.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Tom.
Kathy Kelly.
Tom, I'm sorry, can I jump in again? You know me, never satisfied. I think Stephen Zunis and the other panelists will speak to this very well, but there's a common misconception about nonviolence that it only works if the opponent is weak. And as a matter of fact, nonviolence is a kind of moral jujitsu, as one of the earlier scholars of it said. And so, in fact, the stronger, the more violent, the more oppressive, the more brutal the opponent, the more effective nonviolence can be if you use it correctly. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Kathy Kelly's joining us today. She's a peace activist whose efforts have sometimes led her to living in war zones and prisons. She and her companions believe that where you stand determines what you see. She and an ad hoc circle of internationals have been assisting young Afghans to resettle in safer havens. She co-coordinates the bombkillerdrones.org, is board president of the World Beyond War, and is planning the 2023 Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. Gilda Betancourt works for and supports Nonviolent Peace Force. Her work goes back to 2001, shortly after Nonviolent Peace Force began to organize itself. At that time, she volunteered with the San Francisco Bay Area Nonviolent Peace Force chapter and has been part of NP staff since 2004. She's been part of the board of the Metta Center for Nonviolence since 2005. Gilda was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. Kazu Haga is the founder of the East Point Peace Academy, a core member of the Ahimsa Collective, and author of the book Healing Resistance, a radically different response to harm. He's a trainer, facilitator, and practitioner of nonviolence, restorative justice, meditation, and social justice organizing. He works to bring more healing modalities into social movements and spaces. And finally, Stephen Zunes is a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco. He's the author of scores of articles on strategic nonviolent action and editor of several books, including Nonviolent Social Movements. For 10 years, he served as the chair of the Academic Advisory Committee of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and has worked as a trainer and workshop leader on civil resistance strategies throughout the US and around the world. So, Stephen, I'd like you to start us off and share your experience and observations of what happened in Sudan, and use that as a bridge to our conversation today, because there's a tremendous amount of insight and learning that happened there that could be used in what's happening in Iran today.
Yes, very, very much so. That Sudan, like Iran, for decades was ruled by this coalition from hell of ultra-conservative Islamist and right-wing military officers like Iran. The country was ethnically divided. The regime was quite brutal. In fact, even more so. I mean, this is literally a genocidal regime. One of the most brutal ones on earth. And so I think there are indeed some lessons that the Iranians can learn from their successful 2019 revolution. I should mention that there's a setback late last year when the military once again seized power, though the resistance continues, and it's not been as bad as it was in the 30 years of Bashir's rule. But actually, before I get to that, just in terms of what Americans can do vis-a-vis Iran, I followed the resistance in Iran ever since the revolution. In fact, before the revolution, when there was also very impressive nonviolent resistance against the US-backed Shah, who was also a brutal dictator. And I found that when the United States has been threatening Iran, putting pressure on Iran, that it has consolidated the regime. It's weakened reformers within the regime, and it has weakened the opposition movement in the streets. When the U.S. has backed off, allowed a little space, that has allowed for more political space for resistance. So I think it's important as Americans that we actually help the revolution by pressing the Biden administration to return to the nuclear agreement and stop the threats of war. Because that just enables the regime to hold on to the nationalist card, blame all the opposition as some kind of U.S. conspiracy. We need to remember our history, of course, the fact that there would not be an Islamic Republic had the United States not overthrown the last democratic government in Iran, and that of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. And so remember that the tragedies such as the shooting down of the Ukrainian airliner was a direct result of the U.S. threats of airstrikes following its assassination of the top Iranian military leader. So we need to, there are things we can do in U.S. Policy as well. But shifting to Sudan as a case study. The reason that they were successful, despite everything, was that first of all, it was a commitment to strategic nonviolent conflict. The security force defections, the breadth and depth of the movement, the role of women, and the tactical innovations all played a critical role, as did the support from the international community, the Sudanese diaspora, and key business networks leaders. These factors would likely not have come into play were it not for the strict commitment to nonviolent strategies and tactics insisted upon by the movement leadership, and the inclusion of nonviolence training and the enforcement of nonviolent discipline. I mean, it's ironic that movements in countries with far more resources, less repression, greater homogeneity, and other supposed advantages often succumb to the call by some activists for diversity of tactics or justified defense, ranging from vandalism and attacks against security personnel to armed struggle. And yet they are unwilling to enforce nonviolent discipline within their ranks, but they were quite successful in doing that in Sudan, and that really helped it denied the regime an excuse for even further repression, and got many people in the security forces on their side. Sudan also proved that poverty and poor infrastructure was not an obstacle. Some people think only in more advanced countries can nonviolence work, but Sudan's impoverished country, high literacy rate, poor infrastructure. Indeed, it's one of the poorest countries in the world, exacerbated by rampant corruption, drought, and despite being one of the largest countries in Africa, a lack of adequate transport and other basic infrastructure. The literacy rate is among the literacy rate is among the lowest in the Arab world, and they rank near the bottom in the Human Development Index. Despite this, millions of people successfully mobilized across the country. Another factor is the importance of skills and agency. And there's a debate among social movement theorists regarding the relative importance of structural factors versus agency, and essentially conditions versus skills. I think the case of Sudan underscores the importance of skills and agency. Sudan was previously seen as a hopeless case in terms of democratic change due to the powerful coalition of conservative Islamist and military officers, the weakness of the opposition, and the degree of oppression, ethnic division, poverty, poor infrastructure, thereby failing the standard criteria for democratic change by traditional theorists of democracy. But millions of ordinary Sudanese civilians were nevertheless able to organize, mobilize, and follow through to oust the old regime and bring to power, at least for a time, a civilian-led government. Another important factor was decentralization. The decentralization of the protest, as opposed to everybody just massing in one place in the capital or whatever, ensured high levels of participation by enabling people to not have to travel great distances, but by spreading the actions too widely to be easily suppressed, they became relatively low risk, thereby encouraging even greater numbers. Participation can provide a sense of ownership of a movement, and data has shown that numbers can be a critical variable in the success of an insurrection. The flexibility and willingness to shift and diversify nonviolent tactics as needed prevented the movement from stagnating and kept the regime struggling to find new ways to respond. Another factor was the balance of organizational leadership and grassroots activism. A part of the credit goes to the movement having both strong leadership through the Sudanese professional associations and other established opposition groups, which could coordinate the resistance on a national level, and the resistance committees in the neighborhoods and villages at the grassroots level. The Sudanese appear to have found the right balance between effective organizational leadership providing overall direction and strategy, and the more spontaneous direct action oriented by youth, such as in the resistance committees. And of course, persistence in the face of severe repression. When you're challenging a repressive regime, they're going to come down violently. That's inevitable. It's long been assumed, despite scores of autocratic governments being ousted through civil resistance movements, that nonviolent strategies and tactics simply cannot work against highly repressive regimes. Sudan, however, has long been ranked among the half dozen most violent totalitarian regimes in the world, even worse than Iran. And Bashir, the former dictator who was ousted, had been indicted by the International Criminal Court on multiple counts of genocide, crimes against humanity, and other war crimes. And other top military leaders have been implicated as well. Pro-democracy activists were gunned down in the streets of Khartoum and other cities by the hundreds, yet the protests continued. And there's a quote I want to have from one of the activists in the Forces of Freedom and Change following one of the most notorious massacres on June 3rd of 2019. He said, quote, "People after June 3rd, this day of the massacre, felt they were defeated. The psychological effects of the day of the largest protest, few days that took place at the end of the month, was that we returned the power back to our hands. Everyone in the country felt that we either live or we die, but this is the day we have to return back to the streets and prove that we are powerful, united, and we are not going, and we are going all the way. The military came to the conclusion that they could not continue to rule the country and signed the agreement a week later. And this leads to the next point, responding to disproportionate violence by escalating the nonviolent resistance. Now, there's certainly been noted cases where mass killings of nonviolent protesters, such as China's 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, in which the movement gave up, or South Africa's 1960 Sharpeville massacre, in which the movement shifted to armed struggle. By contrast, the escalation of violent repression by the Sudanese regime led to an escalation of the nonviolent resistance. By succeeding in a struggle against a literally genocidal regime, the Sudanese demonstrated that few pro-democracy activists can use the excuse that their government is too repressive to contemplate nonviolent resistance. The Sudanese recognize that its most powerful weapons against extreme violence are organized and strategically directed nonviolent mobilization and actions. I mean, it's a shame we don't know more about the Sudanese revolution. It didn't get much press despite the size and significance of the country. Perhaps because the idea of an Arab people, a Muslim people, an African people having agency, thinking strategically and effectively utilizing nonviolent action simply does not fit into the Western paradigm. But it gives me the sense that if this can happen in Sudan, it can happen anywhere. And I think it underscores that even a country with such a violent history and all the problems it had, that people could end up indeed winning the day and overthrowing one of the most brutal dictatorships. And again, just to update the political situation, after a couple of years of this civilian military-led coalition, the military did end up seizing power late last year, but they've not been able to have the kind of total control that the previous regime had. The resistance is continuing. There are massive general strikes just a few days ago. The regime is entering negotiations again to perhaps share power. The opposition is saying, no, we're not going to share power again. We want you guys out of the political control. So it's an ongoing situation. But it's an important illustration that one need not have that nonviolent resistance is not just something for pacifists. It's not just something for Westerners who have the leisure, the economic security, or whatever to engage in. It is something that is indeed can be applied universally, even in the most horrifically repressive situations. I have placed in the chat a link to a monograph I wrote on the Sudanese revolution that you're welcome to access. You can also just Google by name, Zunis Sudan ICNC, which is the name of the organization that the educational foundation that published the report, and you can see that. But it underscores my sense that as I've written about for many years, that the power of nonviolent resistance is quite incredible. And if you look at Iran, they have quite a history going back to the tobacco strike and other resistance against concessions back in the 1890s, the constitutional revolution in the beginning of the 20th century, and of course the movement against the Shah. I mean, unfortunately, the reactionary Islamists ended up taking over at the end of the power struggle, but there was very impressive nonviolent resistance against the Shah in the Iranian Revolution, which was initially broad-based. And so we have this there's a long history of civil resistance there, and this idea that there's some kind of a Western plot is ridiculous. We have we in the West cannot teach the Iranians about nonviolent action. They have a remarkable history of themselves. Indeed, we have a lot to learn from them and from the Sudanese and from others around the world who have employed power of strategic nonviolent action.
Thank you, Stephen. That was wonderful. And hopefully there's tremendous resources and information, Bonafshe, you can share and will be shared throughout Iran and the world. I'd like to bring Kathy Kelly into the conversation. Kathy?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Bonafshe and Stephen and everybody who has organized this crucial time. And Bonafshe, it's so difficult at this remote distance to speak words. So with all humility, I just like to channel some of what was told to me before I went to prison for 1 year for planting corn on top of a nuclear missile silo site, and also before I became a war tax refuser in 1980. So I haven't paid any taxes to the United States government, but mentors from the civil rights movement, I once asked, well, don't you ever feel afraid? And I remember Ernest Bromley crossing his long legs and saying, oh, don't you ever let anybody tell you they're not afraid. He said, I guess courage is the ability to control your fears. And just that breathing that you nursed us through, Bonafshe, the ability to control our fears. And then, and this is so hard to say to people because I know they must be looking when they're looking through the barrel of a gun, who is going to help me? But the means you use determines the end you get. And I remember how the United States armed both sides of the Iran-Iraq war, and then imposed the economic sanctions on Iraq that broke that country and slaughtered their children. So we must not look to the warmongers who only ought to be involved in paying reparations to get us through the very difficult situations that we face. We face climate catastrophe, we face pandemic, we face nuclear weapon proliferation, and we must look to one another and not to the people who want to sell more weapons and make more profits from war. So, dear friends, I would like to tell you a quick story from my friend who I met in Afghanistan in 2010. His name is Ali, and after the Uvalde massacre, this young man, whose own brother had been killed because due to poverty, he'd had to enlist in the Afghan National Defense Forces. He wrote to me to ask, how can we help comfort the mothers and fathers who've lost their children? And I said, Ali, do you remember back in 2015 when you and your friends, they were all in their late teens, organized every street kid, child laborer you could find, and you collected as many toy guns as you could, and you buried them, and then you planted a tree on top of that grave of guns. So that was the kind of action that speaks. Remember the woman who ran across the street? You didn't know her, and she came with a shovel because she wanted to help plant more trees. Well, those kinds of messages, as Stephen has shown us, are coming from all over the world at great price to some very brave people. And I think that one of the answers comes from the Kingian nonviolence that says we have to try to see the humanity of our enemy and also try to see ourselves as we're seen by the so-called enemy. So I'd like to share screen for just a moment and offer a few images from the world of art. And the first is just this image of my young friends.
Kathy, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're not seeing your screen yet.
Not. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oops, hang on.
No worries.
I wonder, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Now, yes, it's
Okay.
working.
So down at the very bottom of that picture is Sakina pounding the guns, and surrounding her are her young friends after they buried those guns. But the next image that I'd like to share with you, it's a very strange image, isn't it? This is an Iraqi young man Wafa Bilal. And he was a professor at the New York University. And in 2005, his brother Hajj was killed by a United States aerial bombardment in Iraq. And Wafa felt he had to use his art to try to communicate the humanity of all the people who had been killed in Iraq. So the tattoo artist has first created a map of Iraq on his back, on the professor's back, with all the cities of Iraq, and then is tattooing a red dot for every name of every person killed in Iraq by 2010. And the names, the 90,000 names, are being read in the background by a woman at the microphone. And after the 25,000th dot, there was no more room on Wafa Bilal's back. This helps me remember trying to see the humanity of the so-called enemy. And likewise, the artists who in Pakistan decided that they would create an image of a little girl that would be seen by every drone operator in the skies after that little girl became an orphan because her parents had been killed by a United States drone attack, and she also lost 2 of her siblings. So this art installation will always be in that field. It was cropped from this picture. And then I also think of Adel Al-Mantari, hit by a United States drone in Yemen that killed 4 of his cousins, and he's disabled. He's undergone operation after operation. Never once has the United States tried to help Adel or his family. And then I also think about the family on August 29th in Afghanistan, the family of Zemarai al-Ahmadi and his children, each one of them deserving to live. Little ones who had a family tradition that when Dad came into the courtyard with the car, you know, it wasn't very usual to own a car in Afghanistan and Kabul, in that neighborhood. They'd all run out because Dad would let one of the boys park the car, and then they'd kind of giggle and that's when the U.S. hit the courtyard and killed that family. We cannot look away. And how can we pay attention? I think of the people who held up the silhouettes of each of those people from that family, and then they blocked the road. And to take those kinds of actions that can lead to inconvenience, but I think we should never let inconvenience get in the way of acting in accord with our deepest beliefs. And then I think of Daniel Hale, the whistleblower who now is serving 4 years in Marion Penitentiary because he essentially believed he could no longer steal innocent lives. And so he disclosed papers as a whistleblower that show that 95% of the time, the United States drones did not hit their intended target. And so we know that nonviolence is not only refusing to bear weapons, but also living simply, sharing resources, and then always wanting to become involved in nonviolent resistance. And as we try to see the world as it's seen by our so-called enemies, let's remember where our nuclear weapons are from the United States and how important it is that we pay reparations. I'll be part of a group planning in November 2023, the Merchants of Death, War Crimes Tribunal. We must hold the manufacturers of weapons accountable and find all manner of nonviolent ways never to cooperate again with carrying guns, with killing children. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. The images, I mean, as we all know, images speak in ways that words don't. They are translated all over the world and affect us very deeply. I'd like to have Kazu join us now and share.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, I wanted to share some thoughts today on the relationship between trauma and nonviolent social change and how trauma impacts our ability to practice nonviolence. And nonviolence to me at the largest scale is it's not simply about how people use nonviolent tactics to overthrow governments. And it's really about how we learn to really remember our interdependence with each other, and to remember that even people who use violence, they are not the enemy, that violence itself is the enemy that we are trying to undo. And so how does trauma impact our ability to move through the world with that kind of worldview? In my work today, one of the million-dollar questions that we're asking ourselves is, if we viewed nonviolent action as a modality of collective trauma healing, then how might we approach our work differently? One of the things that I'm interested in doing is to normalize trauma, and to understand that if you are experiencing a trauma response, there's nothing wrong with you, there's nothing broken about you. That trauma is a normal response to living through abnormal circumstances. The last 3 years of this pandemic is not a normal circumstance. War is not a normal circumstance. Living under thousands of years of patriarchy and a disconnect from our natural environment, these things are not normal. We are not meant to live like this as human beings. So it's actually quite natural for us to have trauma responses and to be living with trauma responses. And so I just want to share my screen and offer a few thoughts here. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about fractals. Fractals, as you may know, are patterns that repeat itself over and over and over again, so that no matter how small of a scale you zoom into something, or how large of a scale you zoom out, you see the same thing. It looks the same because the same pattern repeats itself. And you see lots of examples of fractals in nature, from the nautilus seashell to Romanesco broccoli. Another way to look at it is to look at how electrons circle around the nucleus of its cell. And you zoom out a little bit and you look at how a hurricane circles around the eye of its storm. And you zoom out even more and you look at how planets rotate around its sun. And you zoom out even more and you see how galaxies rotate around the center of its axis. No matter how small or large, because we are all governed by the same laws of physics, the same pattern repeats itself. So what does that have to do with trauma and social change? Well, I have a family member who has experienced a lot of trauma in their life, and they've never had an opportunity to heal and integrate that trauma. And so their life is in a constant state of crises. They'll be in a serious crisis around their relationship with their kids. And so we'll spend months supporting them through that. And at some point, that crisis might die down a little bit. Things might get a little easier. And then a month later, there's a major crisis with her work. And that'll die down. And then a month later, there's a major crisis with her relationship with her money and her finances. And it feels like we're always playing this endless game of whack-a-mole, where it's just this never-ending episodes of crises. And at some point, I realized that part of what's going on is this family member experienced core trauma in their early childhood. And until we are able to support that person in healing and integrating their core trauma, their root trauma, then we are going to be playing an endless game of whack-a-mole. We're always going to be facing the next crisis. So we take that analysis and we zoom out of the fractal. And I used to volunteer with an organization that does amazing work helping some of the most marginalized people in society heal through their trauma. And yet, as an organization, the organization was in constant crisis. Volunteers would be leaving and filing lawsuits against the organization. Staff members would be in arguments with the board of directors. There'd be controversies over how funds are being used in the organization. And at some point, I realized that the organization itself as a collective has core trauma, right? That early in the childhood of this organization, the founders of the organization brought some unhealthy practices into the organization that became adopted as the organizational culture. So the leadership would make decisions that would affect the volunteers without consulting the volunteers at all. The founders refused to have conversations about how issues like gender and race and power were playing out within the organization. And so these practices became the organizational culture, the core trauma of the organization, that 30 years later, all of the individual people are different people, but the same patterns continue to repeat itself. So we were always dealing with all of these crises. And until we were able to deal with the root trauma, the organizational culture, we were always going to be playing this endless game of whack-a-mole. Now we zoom out one more time and we look at this nation state called the United States of America. Obviously, I know there's folks from all over the world on this call, but given that I'm in the United States and it's my context, I know that in the United States, there is never a shortage of crises, never a shortage of issues that we're working on, right? Like maybe we'll gain a huge victory on gun control, which of course hasn't really happened, but it's only a matter of time before there's a huge crisis in housing, which we're witnessing all over the country. And it feels like we're playing this endless game of whack-a-mole. No matter how many pieces of legislation we pass, we look at the big picture and it feels like we're never gaining serious momentum. And I think part of it is because collectively as a nation, early in our collective childhood, we experienced some traumatic experiences. This nation is founded on genocide of indigenous peoples and enslavement of African peoples. And we can't experience something like that without those experiences being imbued in our collective memory, in our collective body. And so until we're able to heal those core traumas, all of these issues that you see, prison reform, healthcare, policing, are very surface level manifestations of a much deeper trauma. And so I want to talk a little bit about what happens in our individual bodies when we experience trauma. I'm just going to run through this really quickly. One easy way to understand our brain is to divide it into 3 sections. The reptilian complex, which is the oldest part of our brain, which is responsible for survival. It is responsible for our fight, flight, freeze mechanisms. Then there's the limbic system, which is responsible for things like memory and emotions. The hippocampus is responsible for storing and organizing memory. The amygdala is largely responsible for regulating our emotions. And then there's the newest part of our brains to develop as human beings, which is the prefrontal cortex, the neocortex, which is the executive center of our brain. It's where our logic and thinking happens. It's where creativity happens. It's where art happens. It's where empathy happens. It's where nuance happens, right? When our bodies experience danger and when we feel like we're in danger, when our trauma is triggered, what happens is what psychologists call the amygdala hijacking. The amygdala takes over our brain and pushes everything down to the reptilian complex, the survival center of our brain. Really strong emotions are triggered. That fight or flight mentality kicks in. These are some of what happens in our brains and in our bodies when trauma is triggered. Essentially what happens is our ability to practice nonviolence is lost when we enter a trauma response, right? Our ability to take in new information, our ability to have empathy, our ability to try to understand the perspective of other sides, all of that literally in our brain, those abilities get lost when we are experiencing trauma. In nonviolence, we're taught that the more violence escalates, the more we have to escalate our nonviolent response. And so if your friend is experiencing a real low intensity conflict, you might be able to go to that friend and say, hey, everything's going to be fine. Just take a deep breath. And that might be the appropriate response, right? If we zoom out of the fractal and think about a low intensity level of conflict at a social scale, filling out a petition might be the appropriate response, right? If the conflict you're responding to is a low intensity level of conflict. But as the conflict escalates, we have to escalate our response. So if two people are fighting each other, you may have to physically get in between them and pull them apart, right? That's the appropriate response. Oh. Occupying a highway might feel like an escalated thing to do, but it's actually the appropriate response if the violence that you're responding to is also incredibly escalated. But one of the things that I found in my time in nonviolence is that the more we escalate our tactics of nonviolent resistance, we have this tendency to also escalate polarization and division. We have this tendency to escalate this us versus them worldview, where we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. And it makes sense because the more we escalate our tactics, the more we enter really escalated situations where our emotions get escalated and our neocortex is likely to get disengaged. And we start to see everything in black and white. And I believe that this us versus them worldview is actually what is at the heart of destroying this planet. Our inability to remember our interdependence, that none of us can truly be liberated in any long-term way until we are all liberated. Our inability to remember that central truth is at the heart of what is destroying this planet. And so how do we learn to escalate our tactics and shut down injustice while doubling down on relationship and opening up our opportunities for healing? How do we hold the dignity of all people, even in the case of the most extreme harms? So obviously, the answer to that question is an extremely long conversation, but the one thing that I want to end with for now is that in nonviolence training, traditionally we're used to learning how to build blockades and work with law enforcement and work with the media and work against violent regimes. But in addition to that, I want to suggest that in the short term, we learn how to do emotional regulation tools like the breathing exercise that we did together. That is an important nonviolent tactic. And in the medium term, we create spaces in our communities to honor and to express our grief and our rage. And then in the long term, for all of us individually to commit to our own trauma healing, so that when we show up in these escalated spaces, we can be grounded and we can access the part of our brain that remembers that even the people on the other side of that of the protest line are human beings that are our brothers and our sisters and our family members. And so lots more to talk about, but I know we're also going to be hearing from Gilda, who can share a little bit more about responding to these escalated situations. So I'll pause there and thank you for all your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kazu. Gilda.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Oh my, it is going to be something to try to continue this presentation after hearing Stephen and Kathy and Kazu that are so excellent. And I have been tasked with trying to present Nonviolent Peace Force in about 10 minutes, which the more that I sit here, I think that it's really an impossible task, but I'm going to do my best with the impossible on behalf of the more than 300 people who are part of Nonviolent Peace Force and all the communities that they work with. I'll do my very best. So I'll start by trying to share my screen, and I hope that everyone can see it. Please let me know if you don't.
That's working well, Gilda. Thanks.
Great. So Nonviolent Peace Force, we have this thing which is conflict is not, well, it's inevitable. Let's just put it that way. But violence is not. And what we see as the problem is violence itself. And we need a method to put all of this practice of nonviolence. I get to see nonviolence practiced and used to protect civilians, to prevent violence, and to promote peace every day. And it's one of the reasons that I love this organization as much as I do. We are an international organization that works with communities side by side to basically improve their safety and security through nonviolent means. And I would like to start off with this wonderful picture of the women's peace teams in South Sudan, who are their own entity, but were trained by Nonviolent Peace Force. There's now more than 2,000 of them all over South Sudan. And we were asked earlier what we could communicate to the women and men in Iran of what they could do. And one of the things that I recommend is that this movement not be just in the urban areas, but every part of Iran, and hopefully even beyond. But that is a very important part. So Nonviolent Peace Force made it very clear that they wanted to train women all over South Sudan, not just in the capital of Juba. And women responded. We were offering training in unarmed civilian protection. I'll get into that in a moment. And women kept coming up to us and saying, why do you only train the men? You should train us. We're in this community all the time, and we have our contribution. And this is one of the important things that Nonviolent Peace Forces does, is we recognize capacities all over the world, communities that invite us to work with them. And then we see what was maintaining the peace in the past and what is gone and what can be restored and what different thing do we need to try. So but I love starting with this image of the women in South Sudan because they use song and music and singing and dancing to pump themselves up, because they know that their work is hard. And I think that the women of South Sudan are an excellent example because they are some of the least appreciated women in the world. Unfortunately, there's a lot of places that could compete for that title. But South Sudan is definitely one where I've had women in South Sudan tell me, well, here the hierarchy is male, cattle, and women. And we are changing things. These women are changing the way women are thought about in South Sudan. So let me move on. I was going to start with the slide of why something like Nonviolent Peace Force is needed. But I think, we've all heard it, and what my presenters have shared, in the 2 seconds that I've spoken to you, another person has had to flee their home because of violence. And so part of what we do was in hopes of keeping communities from having to flee. But it goes beyond that in many ways. But let me just start by introducing you to unarmed civilian protection, which is the leading methodology that Nonviolent Peace Force uses. And Nonviolent Peace Force is not interested in being the only practitioner. In fact, we encourage everybody to learn as much about unarmed civilian protection as possible. And I will not go over this whole list, but we like to use this neat little example of a tree, which I think fits very well with Jim's introduction of in honor of the trees. But I think it's also a good example of, we plant a seed, and if we expect a full-grown tree in the next day, we are kidding ourselves. So we are planting seeds, but there are many things that are needed to help this grow. And if you'll look at our methods, you'll see that there's 12 methods that we use and probably more nonviolent methods to do the work that we do. And I'll go a little bit more into them in a little while. But our objectives are to enhance nonviolent responses in conflict, to protect civilians, and interrupt cycles of violence. And our principles, our roots of this tree are our commitment to nonviolence. We have a strict do no harm policy. We believe in the primacy of the local actors. So the communities that invite us to work with them, we listen to them. It is their piece to make and to lead. This is civilian to civilian protection. So there's room for everyone in this nonviolence organization. Everyone can play a little role in it. You can be a person who goes in response, a protection officer who works with the communities, to a person who simply follows the progress of Nonviolent Peace Force and supports this work, and everything in between. So there's room for everyone in this nonviolent work. And we are independent. We don't work on behalf of any government or other organization. We are committed to the goal of nonviolence and peace, and we are nonpartisan. So we do not take sides in the conflict. And this is, I think, one of the things that allows us to do the work that we do. And our tree is lovingly nurtured by relationships. And it is relationship building that we believe can protect civilians, prevent violence, and promote peace. So let me quickly give you an idea of what UCP in practice looks like. I already mentioned that we're civilians to civilians working for one another. We send teams that are multinational. Currently, we have about 30 countries represented in the various teams that we create and send. These are trained people and they are staff. They work with the communities that have invited them, and they live with the communities that so they live on the level of the people who have invited them, usually very simple, humble, and usually in refugee camps. We are gender diverse. So we have about 60% of our teams are male and 40% are female. And we're trying to hit more of a balance. We're always striving for that because very often we're told that certain women can't do this work, and we are proving them wrong constantly. We are, as I said, deeply immersed in the community, and we respond to local needs. So we work with our local partners closely. And we are cost effective. Compared to the military, we are definitely the option that is a lot less expensive. This is just an example of the different places that Nonviolent Peace Force is currently. You can see that starting from the right or the farthest to the east, we're in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Iraq, in both South Sudan, and we recently started a program in Sudan. Unfortunately, there's one little extra country that should be in orange. It is Ukraine. We started a program in Ukraine this year. And then we are in the United States, and that star, the yellow star, is where our headquarters is in Geneva. Now, one of the things that we do, I think probably the thing that UCP is most famous for is accompaniment. And what we've learned is, and how a lot of this work started, is folks noticed that in sometimes the presence of an outsider and the correct level of conflict. So I'm not telling you that we can drop into any violent situation and change things. It's actually quite the opposite. We need to be invited, and in a certain level of conflict, since we are unarmed, we can sort of change how people respond. No one likes to fight in front of the neighbors, and sometimes it changes people's behavior. This, you can see that our people have uniforms. People can see very clearly who we are. And in this picture, we are working with two tribes that are in a refugee camp or an IDP camp in Iraq. And there's some disagreement between the tribes that could actually turn violent, but neither of the tribes wanted to meet with each other. But we agreed that if we would accompany them to a shared meeting space, they would grow and they would discuss. So sometimes we do this on behalf of tribes. Sometimes we accompany journalists who are facing threats, and we think that we can help keep them safer by having some sort of 24-hour bodyguard, even though he's unarmed or she's unarmed, accompany them. This is a quick example of accompaniment. We also do direct protection, which is we strategically place some of our protection officers in places to deter violence. And this is an example of work that we did in the United States. Our team is in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and they prepared and trained volunteers, our staff did, to be ready in case the outcome of the George Floyd trial wasn't what people had expected and more violence could break out. And people told us that they felt so much safer just knowing that we were there. Even though they wanted to be present, they wanted to be public, they were afraid that more violence could break out. But knowing that we were present, they felt safer to do so. And we did this also during the 2020 elections, when people thought that there might be folks disrupting folks at waiting to vote at polling stations. I'm going through this so quickly. I do apologize, but it's only because we have time limits, and I'm happy to tell more people about it, questions afterwards. We do ceasefire monitoring, and we train in ceasefire monitoring, and we train the public and the communities that invite us to do this. Here we are training actually members of the Filipino government, their military. And we know that if people have a better idea of what ceasefire monitoring is, they can help preserve the peace better. And we do this a lot with women in community because people own their ceasefire when they know more what to look for. Some of the work that we're doing in Myanmar and Thailand is we're helping women's groups who want to be more in the peace negotiations and be at the table and be more involved in their politics. We are helping them planning for their safety and security because, as you know, it is a very difficult thing to do right there. We've been there before the coup. We've been there since 2015. But that is some of the work that I'm particularly proud of. Well, all of these teams I'm particularly proud of. But I'm just quickly going to go through back to the women's protections teams in South Sudan. These women, they have been trained to disrupt child marriages and just be the peacekeepers in their communities. So sometimes when people have a question about why can't they get people to stop fighting, they come to these women and they do have advice. They are also working to prevent gender-based violence. So one of the things that we organized were these firewood patrols, because during South Sudan's civil war and even to today, women unfortunately have to go and collect firewood, and they were being raped basically while they were doing that by any side of the parties. And we made a plan with them. They were telling us, oh, I still have to go collect firewood, but we were telling them, oh, well, we'll create these patrols when we tell all the parties, because they have built these relationships with all the warring parties, and saying, we are going to accompany these women while they collect wood, and we know that you don't want anything to happen to them while they're doing that. So we create these large groups. You only see a few people here, but normally they're larger, like 10 to 15 people, where they're collecting wood. And never on one of those patrols in the past few years that we've accompanied have any of the women or any of the protection officers been harmed. So I just wanted to share that. One of the important things that we're doing is we're taking all of this work that we're doing around the globe and we're sharing it with groups like the United Nations and absolutely anybody who wants to learn from it and work with us. We are carrying that on. Like I said, we want to spread as far as we can for anyone who needs assistance. And so we're doing a lot of advocacy in Washington, D.C., in Geneva, Asia. So we want unarmed civilian protection to be available to anyone who wants to try it, and those people to recognize that they're already doing some form of it. And I'd like to finish off with just a quote that one of the founders of Nonviolent Peace Force usually shares, and is everything that is needed to build a true safety and belonging already exists in each of us. And I think one of the most beautiful things that I find about Nonviolent Peace Force is that there's a role for everyone in it everywhere. And what if we were to use our power together, because so many more of us want peace than violence? What if we could find that one little thing that would allow us to do that? And yesterday was the International Day of Nonviolence, by Gandhi. Gandhi asked that we actually think of the spinning wheel, the device that he used and in India used to spin wool and cotton and to cloth, khadi. And what we need is something that everybody can contribute to. And I think that could be global mutual aid in safety. I think Nonviolent Peace Force is trying to encourage this. And I invite you all, I'll share it in the chat, to look to Nonviolent Peace Force. And if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them for you. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to try to stop sharing. And I don't know how to stop. Here we go. So thank you so much for your patience. I probably went over my time, but it's just something that inspires me so. And I think we all could use it because we feel so powerless by the news that we're getting every day. And here is something very concrete that we can do to protect civilians, prevent violence, and promote peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilda. I'd like to invite all of our panelists back at this time. Invite you back as well, Jim. And just a tremendous amount of information shared. I'm so grateful for each of you for bringing your insights, your wisdom, and your information. And most importantly, I want to, for you, Bonafshe, and for the women in Iran and the people of the world to understand that we have tools, we have resources. There are things that have been proven that do work, and that if we can remain hopeful. And so, Michael, I'll just ask you to jump in for a moment before Jim jumps in.
Well, I know this is very, very unusual for me, Tom, but I'm kind of speechless. Like you say, there's been so much information, excuse me, so much information has been shared. And I remember that Mel Duncan, who was the co-founder of Nonviolent Peace Force, he always used to say, and this is not a direct quote, that all the resources are there, but we must kind of train ourselves to recognize them, which is very similar to what you were saying, Gilda, and everybody else was saying. So that, I think, is the critical importance of this conversation that we're having now. We're bringing people's attention to the incredible potential that's just beginning to be I don't want to say exploited, just beginning to be mobilized and put into practice now. So I really have treasured this conversation all along, and I want to thank Kazu, Stephen, Gilda, and you, Bonafshe, and of course, Jim.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for a splendid series of presentations. And I'm just wondering, Bonafshe, as you've been listening to this and contemplating what's useful to your network and the women and activists in Iran, what has struck you about the presentations today? Is there anything that's useful? I mean, what would be your comment?
Oh my goodness, absolutely useful. I think every one of you panelists have given so much important information to us, and created so much hope. The example, Stephen, you gave from the Sudanese nonviolent regime change is so very inspiring, so useful. Kathy's message that courage is controlling our fears and remembering that the means will determine the results is so important. Kazu's invitation to feel our interconnectedness, even with the so-called enemy, and that the more violence and conflict escalates, the more we need to escalate. The non-violent response is so key. And Gilda, your reminder from the Sudanese women to pump ourselves up with dance and music is so helpful, and how each of us have what is needed to create safety is so important. You have all given so much, and I thank you. And I thank you on behalf of the women in Iran who are behind this uprising, and I'm sure that they're filled with hope and inspiration and techniques and tools. So thank you, all of you.
Any quick comments from any of you that you would like to add about your presentations, or any further advice or counsel to the people in Iran? Gilda.
Shall I? I guess one thing I didn't add to my presentation, which I now feel like I should have, is that we must not be forced to think that nonviolence is just protest. This is a problem that we face in the United States, which is people just think nonviolence, and the next thought that comes into their head is protest. And what Nonviolent Peace Force shows every day is there's so many more things that could be done through nonviolent means that actually increase security, that create safety, and that could prevent violence, and protect civilians. So what I would encourage people is to not get stuck in the notion that we need to just protest. There are so many creative things that can be done to try to disempower those who would use force and violence and to prevent the freedom of the people who want it. So creativity is one of the things that we in Nonviolent Peace Force always say. We have to be creative and nimble and be ready to change our methods. Never, ever thinking that violence is justified. Never. That will never work or result in anything positive. But to explore what can be done and to think of that protest isn't a accomplishment in itself. We want to be out of the streets. We want to live our life with freedom. So we need to explore how can we do those things through nonviolent means, and how can we disempower those who would control us through nonviolent means, but make it impossible for them to rule us, to sort of create a duplicate way of existence that isn't dependent on the forces that be, but to create our own way. So that's one thing that I think is very important to share with those who are resisting evil and violence right now.
Thank you. Tom, do you have any closing comments or anything that you would like to bring in about tomorrow, for example, before we close?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And thank you all again, each of you, for not just for being here today, but your lifetime commitment for the work that you're doing around nonviolence. Tomorrow, we're gonna continue the conversation because there are so many instruments of nonviolence being used to successful outcomes around the world. And so we'll be continuing that conversation tomorrow and throughout the week, and just building off of all of the amazing conversations we had last week. So I just want to thank Jim and the team at Humanity Rising, and certainly Michael, for helping to put this really important and timely conversation together. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Banafsheh, any final words?
Just very inspirational. Thank you, everyone. And everyone, let's please hold Iran in your prayers, in your intentions for nonviolent regime change. This would be so amazing for the whole world if we can manage this. And I say we because we are all in this together. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Banafsheh. Michael?
Yeah, our role will be, if there is nonviolent regime change, to let the world know about it, because so often those things have been forgotten about and passed over, and we keep recreating, as Kazu was pointing out, the same traumas over and over again. So let's be quite alert to recognize and be willing to promote and share any nonviolence that happens in the turmoil to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And we're very aware, obviously, as Gilda and many of you indicated, there's violence going on all over the world. We've been focusing on Iran because of the, almost I would say, the numinosity of the death of Mahsa Amini and the way that it's inspired just a surge of concern, protest, activism around the world, in many ways like the George Floyd death did in May of 2020. So we've been tracking that. And Banafsheh, I want to really thank you for coming on Humanity Rising so spontaneously as world events were unfolding. It's been quite extraordinary, and we hope that as the days progress, you'll continue to come on and share with us what's happening so that we can participate in one of the front lines that is taking place in a very violent way, and therefore gives us a unique opportunity to explore the utility of nonviolence in the face of that coercive power of fundamentalism and the state. So thank you. Really want to acknowledge what you're doing through all the women that are mobilizing in that part of the world. So that brings us to a close, everyone. For today, you're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the chat link in the chat if you want to join. And then we'll see everybody here, same time, same station tomorrow for day 7 of the 10-day program on nonviolence that's being convened by Tom and Michael. Thank you all so much. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.